Ladies and gentlemen, Prime Minister Key, John Howard, Tony Abbott. My name's Tom Harley, and I'm the chairman of the Menzies Research Centre, and I'm delighted to welcome you here to the third John Howard Lecture. Before we start, I want to acknowledge a number of people who are here. Of the Shadow Cabinet, we have present the Deputy Leader and Shadow Foreign Affairs and Trade Minister, Julie Bishop, the Deputy Senate Leader and Shadow Attorney, George Brandis, Kevin Andrews, the Shadow Minister for Families, Housing and Human Services, and Philip Rudnick, Secretary to the Shadow Cabinet. I mention this group first because, along with Tony Abbott, all served in the Howard Cabinet or Ministry. The Abbott Shadow Ministry has an asset of great value, a cadre of experienced and highly capable ministers, being men and women who had been at the centre of a respected and successful government. The Abbott-led party has also been refreshed with new talent in the Shadow Ministry, and I welcome Sophie Mirabella, Shadow Minister for Innovation, Industry and Science, Senator Scott Ryan, the Shadow Parliamentary Secretary for Small Business, and I also welcome Federal MPs Alex Hawke, Kelly O'Dwyer and Josh Frydenberg, who was an alumni of John Howard's office, and John Alexander, who took back Bennelong from a usurper, and Craig Kelly. State MPs Alistair Coe, Catherine Cusack and Matt Keane. I also welcome two former members of the Howard Cabinet. First, a former Liberal leader and John Howard's Foreign Minister, Alexander Downer. And second, former Environment Minister and a current Director of the Menzies Research Centre, Ian Campbell. Former federal parliamentarians present are John Stone, Guy Barnett, Bruce Baird and Chris Miles. Former state ministers and members Michael Photius, Mark Birrell, Peter Collins and Peter Seaton. Former leader of the Liberal Party in the ACT, Bill Stefaniak. The federal president of the Liberal Party, a current director of the MRC and former Victorian Treasurer Alan Stockdale. And my other fellow directors of the Menzies Research Centre, Paul Espy, Michael Osborne, May Kaur and Julian Leeser. Let me also acknowledge Brian Loughnane, the Federal Director of the Liberal Party, His Excellency Martin Dunn, the New Zealand High Commissioner to Australia, Jane Clark, the widow of David Clark, the founding chairman of the Menzies Research Centre, and Paul O'Sullivan, a distinguished former Australian diplomat and immediate past High Commissioner to New Zealand, also an alumni of John Howard's office. I'm certain there are others. About event. Your presence is a testimony to the fact that this John Howard Lecture is becoming one of the most significant events on the Australian policy and political calendar. Each year, the Centre invites a distinguished speaker to present a thought-provoking topical address dealing with issues of current and future importance to Australia. Let me thank John Howard for his patronage and for his significant enthusiasm for the series. As well as providing the opportunity to present a significant oration, the Howard Lecture has become an important part of the Centre's contribution to practical policy development. Last year's address, which some of you were at, was by UK Cabinet Minister Ian Duncan Smith. It is a good example, for he helped inform the development of the Coalition's policy on the charitable sector, which was launched by Kevin Andrews at an MRC address last month. I'm certain tonight's lecture will make a similar contribution to our thinking about policy development and the practical business of getting reforms done. The Menzies Research Centre aspires to be the think tank of the Liberal Party. We see one of our key roles as bringing the best policy experts and practitioners together with the Liberal politicians responsible for delivering and implementing policy. We hope to make connections and provide ideas that might not otherwise enter the policy-making process. Over the years, the Centre has been able to attract leading figures in business, the non-government sector, including charitable organisations, the public service, the media, jurists, and even a couple of former Labor ministers to participate in our activities. Our forward program this year includes policy roundtables on defence, foreign affairs and trade and small business, as well as a panel lecture on environmental planning and contracting out government services. In the coming weeks, we'll be launching Federal Policy Perspectives, which showcased the key ideas that were presented at the Centre's recent roundtables on topics as diverse as science and technology, manufacturing policy, and the productivity agenda. Later this year, the Centre will be publishing State of the Nation, a major work featuring chapters by significant independent policy experts delivering an evidence-based critique of policy development over the last 5 years, and some of the contributors are here tonight. We were proposing a work called The Future of the Greens. It was deemed too short to merit publication. But seriously, we have commissioned an academic assessment of the real implications of the Greens' policies, a neglected but much-needed analysis. More details on these projects and information about how your tax-deductible donation can support Menzies in making a contribution to the policy debate is available in the prospectus, which is on your chair. For those viewing tonight on APAC or the ABC, you can visit our website on www.mrcltd.org.au. Ladies and gentlemen, we are honoured that the third John Howard Lecture is being delivered by the Prime Minister of New Zealand. Prime Minister, Australians admire the direct, straightforward, transparent, principled way you've achieved major reforms in tax and other areas in New Zealand. All Australians admired the courage of your countrymen at the time of the Christchurch earthquake. And we yearn for a government like yours in our country. And the man who's tireless and relentless in trying to bring about such a government is Tony Abbott, who I call on to introduce Prime Minister Key.
Thanks very much, Tom. Well, Prime Minister Key, former Prime Minister Howard, Excellencies, parliamentary colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Australia and New Zealand are independent countries, but we are the international version of identical twins. We have the same language, the same values, and essentially the same institutions derived from Britain. Our issues, aspirations, and even our internal disagreements are largely the same. I shouldn't pretend that there are never any difficulties at all between us. For instance, as Health Minister, I discovered that establishing a Trans-Tasman Therapeutic Goods Administration would be almost as difficult and drawn out as establishing the mutual recognition of professional credentials amongst the Australian states. Still, these were differences of detail, not of belief. The relationship between Australia and New Zealand is about as troubled as the relationship between the United States and Canada. The challenge is not turning a fraught relationship into a fraternal one, because the relationship could hardly be more cordial than it is. Rather, the challenge is not to take it for granted. The task is not to address any problems between us, because there really are none. The task is to consider the problems that we both grapple with and to learn from the ways in which those problems are tackled on different sides of the Tasman Sea. Over the past 2 decades, New Zealand has been an economic policy laboratory, trialling measures that were subsequently applied in Australia too. First, the Longy-Douglas Labor government floated the dollar, removed farm subsidies, deregulated finance markets, cut taxes and tariffs, and introduced a GST. Then the Bolger National Government privatised government-owned enterprises, introduced a form of work for the dole, and deregulated the labour market. After almost 2 decades of reform, the Clark Labor government abolished work for the dole, renationalised businesses such as Air New Zealand, re-regulated the labour market, and in September 2008 enacted a limited form of emissions trading scheme. So I congratulate the Key government for its work to restore strength and dynamism to the New Zealand economy by cutting tax, partially privatising government business enterprises, reintroducing flexibility into the labour market, and winding back New Zealand's emissions trading scheme. There has been a massive fiscal turnaround amounting to a 5% of GDP shift. In this, John Key has been the very model of a contemporary centre-right Prime Minister. So there is much that those on this side of the Tasman can learn from Conservatives on the other side. Given John Key's credentials as a reformer and as a restorer, it's fitting that the Menzies Research Centre has chosen him as this year's John Howard Lecturer. John Key has not only been a reforming Prime Minister, but a reforming Prime Minister who increased his majority at last year's election, as John Howard did here in 2001 and 2004. And as the number of MPs tonight testifies, we in Australia look forward to learning from John's domestic policy, and should the Liberal and National parties form a government, working closely with him on foreign policy issues. Happily, ladies and gentlemen, Australasia has 2 votes in the councils of the world. Australia and New Zealand will be 2 distinct voices, but I'm confident that for the next few years at least, we'll be saying essentially the same thing. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are indeed very lucky to have as our lecturer tonight John Key, and I'd ask you to make him extremely welcome.
Tony, thanks very much. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for making me feel so welcome. So much so to the extent that you turned on a great Wellington Day for me here in Sydney. Can I just start this evening by acknowledging some of the very special guests that are in the room. Former Prime Minister John Howard, as I say, Leader of the Opposition, Tony Abbott, and members of his parliamentary team. I'd also very much like to thank the Menzies Research Centre for inviting me to give this lecture. The Menzies Research Centre has made an important contribution to public policy thinking in Australia over many years. It is, I might say, a very impressive institution. I was delighted some time ago to accept its invitation because I have a great deal of respect and admiration for John Howard. I will always remember the week I became the leader of the National Party in New Zealand towards the end of 2006. I was scheduled, as fate would have it, to fly to Canberra in my previous capacity as the finance spokesman, but instead made the trip as the newly minted leader of the National Party. Very short notice, Prime Minister Howard made time in his extremely busy schedule to see me and dispense his best wishes, along with some great centre-right advice. Aside from the personal encouragement he gave me, it was a very public signal that helped me, as a new leader, settle into my role. Over the following years, we developed a very close relationship. John was a great Prime Minister of Australia, in my view, one of the greatest Prime Ministers of Australia. And he was a great friend of New Zealand, working hard to strengthen the relationship between our 2 countries. In doing so, he worked closely with my predecessor, Helen Clark, despite their domestic political differences. Following that example, I've worked hard to have a constructive relationship with Kevin Rudd and in recent times with Julia Gillard. I learned a lot from John Howard, both from my discussions with him and watching him as Prime Minister. I admired the economic program he oversaw in Australia, his steady leadership through difficult times, and his tenacity. By the time you've been Prime Minister for 11 years, let alone twice been Leader of the Opposition, you've fought a lot of battles and you've faced a lot of challenges. It reminds me of a story about the Civil War general Ulysses S. Grant. After a day in which his forces took a real beating, his second in command, General Sherman, found him sitting under a tree chewing a cigar. "Well," said Sherman, "we've had the devil's own day, haven't we?" "Yes," said Grant. "Lick him tomorrow, though." That's what being a Prime Minister is often like. Can I also say that it's a great pleasure to be here in Australia. Australians and New Zealanders, all 27 million of us, share a very special corner of the globe. Geography, our shared colonial history, and our cooperation in peace and in war have made our 2 countries very close. Our soldiers have served together in many distant parts of the world and continue to do so even today in Afghanistan. These deployments are not without risk, and I want to acknowledge the SAS soldier who lost his life in Uruzgan just 3 days ago. For a long time, our two countries were isolated from the rest of the world. We had little to do with the Asian countries to the north and west of us, and England was anywhere up to 6 months hazardous sailing away. Nowadays, the world is much smaller and far more interconnected place, yet our countries remain as close as ever. We have a comprehensive trade and economic agreement without the drawbacks of a common currency. Australia is New Zealand's most important trading partner and our most important source of foreign investment. And at a practical level, we are always there for each other. That was reinforced for New Zealanders in the aftermath of the Canterbury earthquakes and the Pike River mine disaster. When 300 Australian police officers arrived at Christchurch Airport, they were met with a spontaneous standing ovation. It was very moving and a visible demonstration that we weren't on our own. Australia was there to support us. You had our back. In return, New Zealand has always been there to help Australia, most recently after the Victorian bushfires and the Queensland floods. In your time of need, we also gave you one of our best rugby coaches, Robbie Deans. I'm really hoping that this will make you a little more competitive, because from the time I've been Prime Minister in late 2008, the head-to-head record between our national rugby teams reads All Blacks 9, Wallabies 2. I'll leave you to your own conclusions about that. Tonight I want to talk about my approach to politics and what drives me and what the government I lead in New Zealand has been doing. I want to make it clear that I'm not here to suggest any particular policy approaches for Australia. That is for the Australian politicians and Australian voters to decide. But I can give you a sense of where I come from and how the national-led government in New Zealand have been dealing with some of the challenges our country faces. And there's certainly been some big challenges. One has been to begin the long process of rebalancing the economy. The New Zealand economy lost competitiveness in the 2000s because growth was built on all the wrong things: debt, consumption, and a 50% increase in government spending in just 5 years. Those factors acted together to suffocate the tradable sector in New Zealand, which effectively went into recession from 2004 onwards. So we've been doing a lot of work to change some of the key settings in the economy, help keep the pressure off interest rates and the exchange rate, and ensure that the public sector isn't diverting too many resources away from the tradable sector. Another test for the country has been the fiscal challenge posed by the combination of a domestic recession, the impact of the global financial crisis, and the cost of the Canterbury earthquakes. From the beginning of the recession in early 2008, the New Zealand economy shrank by 3.3% in 18 months, and tax revenue fell by 10%. And while most of the damage from the earthquakes is covered by insurance, the government is still expecting to face a final bill of around about $13 billion, or 6.5% of GDP. As a government, we've absorbed much of the cost of the recession and the earthquakes on our balance sheet, thereby cushioning New Zealanders from the worst impacts. But that money has to be paid back, and so we've put a huge amount of effort into making savings, and in particular into changing some of the long-term drivers of government spending, so we can get back to surplus over the next years and start getting our own debt down again. The challenges we've faced haven't just been economic, of course. We've also been dealing with long-standing social problems that have defied the easy solutions. In the 2000s in New Zealand were characterised by the idea that big increases in government spending dispensed across a whole range of areas and in a relatively untargeted way could transform a society. However, that particular experiment ran out of money in 2008 with little genuinely transformational to show for it, and the problems still remain. As Prime Minister, I'm responsible for leading the government's response to these and other challenges. As John F. Kennedy once said, we in government are not permitted the luxury of irresolution. Everywhere else can debate issues forever, but in the end, the government has to cut through all that and make a decision which will invariably please some and disappoint others. In making those decisions, my government has been very pragmatic. We are guided by the enduring values and principles of the National Party, but we're also focused on what is sensible and indeed what is possible. Partly that is the nature of the political system in New Zealand. It is sometimes said that politics is about convincing 50% of the population plus one, and that has never been truer than under the MMP system we have in New Zealand. Don't get me started. But in any event, I think government is a practical business. You don't start with a blank sheet of paper, you start with the country as it is. And by making a series of sensible decisions which build on each other and which are signalled well in advance, and by taking most people with you as you go, you can effect real and durable change which won't simply be reversed by the next lot who come into government. Over time, a series of moderate changes can add up to a considerable program. That's been our experience in New Zealand. In terms of the fiscal outlook, we have effected a significant turnabout. The advice we've had from Treasury when we first came into office was that if we continued with the settings we inherited, net government debt was likely to reach 60% of GDP by 2026. Now, after the changes we've made, net debt is projected to be zero in 2026, despite the government picking up most of the cost of the Christchurch earthquakes. We've also implemented the biggest changes to the tax system in a generation to increase incentives to work hard, save and invest, and decrease the incentives to consume. That's included increasing GST, bringing down personal tax rates across the board, harmonising the top personal rate at 33 cents in the dollar with the trust rate, and dropping the company tax rate to 28%. We've reformed our planning laws and labour laws, and we are investing heavily in New Zealand's infrastructure, including state highways, ultra-fast broadband and the national electricity grid. We've embarked, as Tony said, on a process of selling minority stakes in 4 state-owned energy companies, and we've wound back an overly onerous and expensive ETS, including the work this week of delaying further costs on New Zealand consumers till at least 2015. We are making significant changes to the welfare system, including work obligations for sole parents when the youngest child turns 5, and we're undertaking a long-term program of public sector reform. This includes a real focus on results, getting traction on difficult issues like reducing crime and long-term welfare dependency. Throughout this time, we've been consistent and upfront with New Zealanders about what we're doing and why we're doing it, and we've retained pretty broad support across New Zealand. I want to stress, however, that while I think government is about practical, considered decision-making, it's not a technocracy. In the end, the biggest, most fundamental decisions governments are called on to make are not reducible to a calculation in a spreadsheet. Those decisions rely on judgment of politicians around concepts like fairness, opportunity, and the balance between individual and social responsibility. As a politician, my own gut-level judgments have been hugely influenced by my upbringing and my life experiences. I was a kid who benefited from the welfare state and had a mother who pushed us to improve ourselves through hard work. My father died when I was very young, when I was 6 years of age. We had no other family in New Zealand and we had very little money. My mother was on a widow's benefit for a time before she started working as a cleaner. The state provided us somewhere to live and ensured my mother had food to put on the table when we most needed it. The state also gave me the opportunity to have a good education at the local high school and at university. My mother made sure I seized that opportunity with both hands. She was a very strong character and escaped persecution in Austria before the Second World War. What she gave to me and my sisters was far more valuable than money. Her constant refrain to me was, "John, you get out of life what you put into it." My early life was therefore a mix of very strong influences: a close family, an emphasis on individual responsibility and hard work, first-hand experience of the welfare system, and a realisation of the opportunities that education offers to kids from even the most humblest of homes. Those influences have undoubtedly shaped my views on the appropriate role of government. I believe in a government that looks after its citizens and provides them with opportunities to flourish, but recognises that people are responsible for their own lives and the well-being of their families. The way